Shalom, good evening, and welcome to the practical Parsha, in which we're going to take an idea, a theme of the Parsha, and focus in on how it applies to nowadays in Jewish law. So this week's Parsha is Parshat Terumah. Terumah, chapter 25 in the book of Exodus. Now, literally the word Terumah means an offering. Okay? Why? Because the Parsha begins and it says, Hashem spoke to Moshe, speak to the children of Israel, and have them take for me a terumah offering. A offering from every man whose heart impels him to generosity, shall you take my terumah offering. And what is this offering going to be used for? What is this all about? So it goes on telling us, the gold, the silver, all kinds of things that is needed in order to do what? Well, look at verse 8. Turn to chapter 25, verse 8. All this stuff, all this raw material that they are going to offer out of the goodness of their heart, ve'asu li migdash, they shall make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell in their midst. So Hashem tells us, I want you to take all these materials, the wood, the materials, the cloths, the gold, the silver, and with that you're going to construct, as is going to be prescribed in the Parsha, this week's Parsha and next week's Parsha, all the dimensions and the exact requirements for the building of this tabernacle, of this Migdash, of this holy dwelling for God's presence. According to all that I am showing you, the form of the Mishkan, which is the tabernacle, and the form of all its vessels, and so should you make. And so shall you make. So this is the Parsha in which we learn about the construction of the Ark of the Covenant, the menorah, not necessarily in this particular order, the menorah, the special table that had the showbreads, the altar, the inner altar, the outer altar. The inner altar was the one for the incense. The outer one was the large one, which later we'll learn about, was made out of copper, the wash basin, and of course the courtyard, and the tabernacle itself, and all its curtains and how it was covered and so on. That's really this week's Parsha. How would this apply to our lives? Well, first of all, if we look again at verse 8, look what it says. It says, they shall make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in their midst. In them. Literally, in Hebrew it says in them. And the Talmud immediately comments on this. Inside them, amongst them, in their midst. The Talmud comments on this, and the Talmud says, notice it doesn't say, V'shachanti b'tocho, and I will dwell in it. Build me a tabernacle, and I will dwell in it, which is true. God's presence will dwell in it more so than anywhere else in the world. And that's called the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah is the level of godliness that's mostly felt, or more felt than anywhere. Because obviously God is all over. God is here, God is near, God is everywhere. However, in the tabernacle, and later in the Bet HaMikdash, in the Holy Temple, of course God's presence is even more there. But over here it doesn't say betocho, in it. It says in them. And this tells us, say the sages, that Hashem will dwell through the concept of the Bet HaMikdash, of the Holy Temple, the tabernacle. Hashem says, I will dwell in each and every one of the Jewish people. And that's what this week's Parsha is about. Because really, if you think about it, we don't have the actual temple today. Interesting, I want to just give you historically, and therefore also legally speaking, when they had a tabernacle, the place on which they erected the tabernacle, regardless of how long it stood there, whether it was several hours a day, or whether it was like in one place, I believe close to 19 years, they didn't travel. Remember, they were 40 years in the desert, right? And they only would travel by the signal of God, which was the cloud of glory that started to travel and lift it up and show them the way. And then would fold it up, dismantle it, pack it up on the wagons, carry what they had to carry, as prescribed in next week's Parsha, and they would move on. But regardless of how long it was there, the earth on which he stood remained holy only temporarily. Temporarily meaning, once the Mishkan, once the tabernacle moved away from there, that spot is as holy or unholy as any other spot in the world. The exception, however, is once they arrived in Jerusalem, once they built the Bet HaMikdash, the holy temple, the first one, and later the second one stood at the same spot, that actual territory became holy. Thus, even today, that the Bet HaMikdash, the actual temple, is destroyed. There are very, very little remnants of it, yet the place itself is holy. And that's important to know because, just not that this wasn't the focus of the class, but it's worth mentioning. When you visit Israel, and of course, idealistically, patriotically, and as a people, we want to say we want access to the Temple Mount, and rightfully so. However, one needs to be very cautious and aware of exactly where one may and where one is not allowed to go, to venture. Because regardless of the fact that the walls are no longer there, the perimeter in which one was allowed to enter in an impure state, in the perimeter in which one was allowed to enter, even if they were pure, if you're not a Kohen, if you weren't an actual priest, and then even the priests themselves, there was the Holy of Holies where they couldn't just enter. Even the highest priest, the Kohen Gadol, could not enter only on Yom Kippur and only after meeting certain requirements and all these prerequisites. So you understand that it's not so simple to just venture in there, because one can now be doing one of the major transgressions, which is trampling on God's holy territory in an impure state, and that actually brings with itself, biblically, some of the most severest punishment of death.
Yes, it is.
Okay? So therefore, it's good to be aware of it. And in fact, there were very good people over the years who would stand there, who volunteered to stand there, would hold signs and say, look, dear Jewish man or woman, please, past this point is really forbidden according to Jewish law to go. And this is actually a very important thing, because it tells us, wow, how real it is, the presence of God and the presence of holiness, even though the actual stone are gone, even though the actual walls are not there. The actual physical beauty and glory is gone, at least temporarily, until Mashiach comes. So this is a very important thing. But I want to focus on another kind of mikdash, another kind of holy sanctuary. And that is precisely the synagogue. The synagogue. There are two types of synagogue. What does that mean, two types of synagogue? Well, halachically speaking, legally speaking, there is something called a bet knesset. Literally means a house of gathering to pray. And then there is something called a bet midrash, the house of study. They have slightly different legal ramification. Actually, one has a greater status of holiness or reverence.
Which one?
Yet, it seems to be a little more lenient on what you're allowed and not allowed to do there. And I'll explain as we go along. But before I explain, understand that there's a verse in the prophets that says, God says, Ve'ehi lahem mikdash ma'at, I will be for them a miniature sanctuary. And that's saying, God's saying, I'll always remain with them. And the sages say, but what specifically does this mean? What does this mean? What does these words mean? And he says that is every single house of worship. That every house that's of course, in accordance with the Jewish law, in accordance with what the Torah wants and the way we worship God, that becomes a miniature sanctuary. That is actually, at least spiritually, replicating the Holy Temple. And a place where one not only prays, but also is a designated place for Torah study, that becomes even greater, because now you're not only worshiping God through prayer, there's also the immersion in Torah study, which is connecting to God on another level, intellectually, in addition to emotionally. Now, Bet Knesset, literally, like I said, means a house of gathering. That's a place that's designated exclusively for prayer. Even typically in many, many community centers, Jewish community centers, you actually will find that they have what they call the weekday sanctuary, okay? And then they have the one they use in Shabbat. Typically, that big giant one they use in Shabbat is purely designated for prayer, because they only gather in there for prayer. And therefore, it has some very, very strict restrictions as to what is not allowed to be done there. Why? Because it's a place that is exclusively designated for prayer to God. It's not a place that you eat. It's certainly not a place that you sleep. Well, unless the rabbi is giving a long sermon, okay? But it's not a place that you should be going to sleep in. And, well, as we'll learn, as in the course of it, furthermore, that there are also modes of behavior, how you behave in such a place, how you should not behave in such a place, things that you should not do. Now, there is something called a Bet Midrash. Like I said, Bet Midrash means the house, literally the house of study. The house of study is a place where you both study and pray. It's greater in the sense that you do so much more there. However, because it's a place that's also designated for study, so it's not exclusively just for prayer, for gathering just for prayer, therefore, there are certain allowances, especially considering that the people who study there need to have these conveniences in order to be able to study, such as eating, drinking, such as even maybe sleeping. There were times when great scholars didn't go home. They studied until they could no longer keep their eyes open. They lay down to sleep for a couple hours and they continued studying. They washed their hands and continued studying. So that you understand the reason, even though it's greater in importance, but because of its designation, it is more room, there's more allowance. Now, obviously, these days, most shuls, what we call a shul is a Yiddish word, actually, I can say are almost like, without even explicitly determining and designating it as such, are most likely Bet Midrash. Why? Because it's very much assumed and accepted that that place is going to be a place that we're going to pray there when we pray there, but when we have to study there. Furthermore, it's quite acceptable that a rabbi gives a sermon, or if a rabbi has to speak to the community. So therefore, it's kind of understood that this place was not just designated just for prayer, but for prayer and for a sermon, which is study of Torah. You understand? So therefore, of course, when one is actually, seeking to know, is this a Bet Knesset? You have to ask a competent rabbi, somebody who's well versed in those laws, what exactly is the designation? Okay? What I would say, for example, is when you go to the real old shuls. When I say the real old shuls, I'm talking about those that are several hundred years old. So what they typically would have is a main sanctuary with the women's gallery, and on the side they would have rooms for study, for the library, and so on. I would imagine, I'm almost certain, that in those big synagogues one has to behave like one would behave in a Bet Knesset. This is really serious stuff, and especially it's serious because remember, even after it loses its official glory, namely, it's not serving as a shul, it still has the holiness. Because remember, it's like the Bet HaMikdash. It still has its holiness. And therefore, even though it's not functioning right here, right now as a shul, and you have many like that. I have a friend of mine who just came back from Spain. He was during the summer, and he showed me one of the most ancient shuls, which today they're trying to bring it back to the Jewish community, but it just serves as a beautiful museum. So I'm thinking, if you think about it, you can't just walk through there without any reverence of the place, even though it's not functioning as a shul, but literally you can't just walk in there, walk out there, stroll around, and even think about it, taking a picture, having lunch, and things like that. Whoa, this is a holy place. At one time people prayed here, it was designated for that. No fault of theirs was it taken away from the Jewish people during the Inquisition or whatever, what have you, and turned into something else. But the place is still there, God's presence is still there, and this was built with the dedication to Hashem. So no one can undo that. Whatever God's reason is that temporarily He wants it to appear as if He has no control, that's His business. I don't know, and I don't answer for Him. He didn't hire me as an advocate. But as far as the place and what is designated, what Jewish law calls for the mode of behavior, that is quite certain. For example, what kind of behaviors are forbidden? Especially in a Bet Knesset, and you're familiar now with the terms. Bet Knesset is a house of gathering, which is for prayer, but even a Bet Midrash. Just because you're allowed to do certain things doesn't mean now you can trample on the decorum of the place. You're not allowed to, for example, use it as a shortcut. You're not allowed to use it as a shortcut. So if you have a big synagogue, you can't walk in one end and go out the other end, and in European cities, that will bring you to the next street, okay, or down into the alleyway. No, you have to walk around. Now, what happens if it's raining outside and you got to find shelter from the rain? You can't use the synagogue for a shelter. It's not a bus shelter. You can't use it to shelter yourself from the sun. Walking in New York City and you want to go into a shul, the air conditioning is really working full force. Great, you want to go in and cool down. You can't do that. However, you could implement I don't want to use the word trick, but if you're aware of the halacha and you do something of holy nature in there, then that's okay. Then you don't have to leave immediately after you eat. You couldn't find shelter. So if you go in and you say a verse, you go in and you say a prayer, or even it says, you go in and you sit down. And there's a verse that's quoted, I don't recall it offhand, quoted in Code of Jewish Law, that even just sitting down in a shul, just sitting down and being there, not just standing for a second and running out, but being present there is in itself a mitzvah. So you've just done a mitzvah. That's okay. You didn't just use it for your purposes. You use it for the sake of why it's there. That's fine. You see that? But also, certainly it's obvious you shouldn't be doing things that are not in the right respect of any place, something you wouldn't do in a respectable place, that's something which is anything from, as the term in halacha is, kalut rosh, lightheadedness. It's not a place to even, it says you're not to do your own calculations. It's not a place to just sit down and do your business. It's not a train station. It's not Grand Central. It's a holy place. Now, there's certain calculations you could do. Calculations of mitzvah. You're running a tzedakah fund, or you're counting the money from the charity box. Tzedakah meaning charity. You have as I remember very, very vividly, and fondly, my wife's grandfather, who ran a gemach, which is a free loan society to help people, and he was sitting in one of the first front benches in the 770, our main shul, the Chabad shul in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, the Rebbe shul, and that was his permanent place where people knew this was a service of help to people who needed loans, who needed to get by for the week, for the day, for their business, or whatever it is. That's perfectly fine. That's in the spirit of what the place is about. The place is about Torah, Tefillah, which is prayer, and Gimilut Chasadim, doing kindness. These are the three pillars of Judaism that hold up the world. Yeah. That's fine. But to be there, and unfortunately people do it, and again, they don't do it out of ill intent, but sadly lose the sensitivity for the importance of the holiness and the reverence of the place, and start talking about their own business, their own stocks, their own this. It's really not appropriate. It's really not a place. It's not a social hall. It's not a place where you can just come and gather for that. It tends, sadly, sometimes to become that because people, and just to, as a defense, you always have to look at the bright side and always have to try to find a defense for our fellow Jews. It's actually a good thing. It shows how comfortable they are in the house of God. But sadly, it's sometimes too comfortable. You know what I'm saying? Too comfortable. Another example is, it really should not be walking into shul. It says with your boots, full of mud and everything. You clean your feet before you go in. It's not a place, it says even, to bring certainly into a Bet Knesset. Into a Bet Midrash, perhaps it's not such a big issue because it's a place that's maybe, hey, come in, be comfortable, sit down and study. But in a Bet Knesset, which is again a place that's designated exclusively just for prayer, you can't just come in with your attaché, with your backpack, and just stroll in there. No. You leave it outside. Why? It's not respectable. Think about it. Would you go into the palace of a king like that? No. You leave everything behind. You leave it outside. You come in as neat as possible. You dress properly. So I'm just giving you some example of the decorum that in a Bet Knesset, in a Bet Midrash, the way it's supposed to be. It's a place that's supposed to be even very, very clean. I have to tell you that sadly, sometimes people, the more religious they are, sadly, don't pay enough attention to that. I, with my own eyes, as a child, as a young man, I've seen several times, on several occasions, and certainly heard many more stories, of the Rebbe, for example, walking into shul and stopping to pick up, times that people used to smoke a cigarette butt from the floor, and this is in front of them, in front of a whole crowd, or a piece of paper or something. It's a mitzvah, and no one is big enough not to do this mitzvah of making sure that because no one is bigger than God. This is God's house. In your own house, somebody drop a cigarette, well, you just leave it there, you clean
absolutely.
It up. Likewise, it's important. It says, actually, similar to what it says by the Holy Temple. The Rambam, Maimonides, tells us that although the walls in the Holy Temple were stone, but in accordance with the ability of the people, so too goes up the elegance of the place. To the point, he says, that if people can afford it, and there was times in the Bet HaMikdash when this was the case, the walls were coated in gold. Do you know what it means, that structure? You know how much gold you need to cover the walls in gold? Now, there were times when even the doors weren't gold because they couldn't afford it. They had to scrape the gold off. But my point being is, there's no end in how much you beautify the synagogue. However, understanding the fact that if the money is needed to help the poor, obviously you have to make a proper, balance, not just have a beautiful synagogue that people don't have what to eat. So it needs to be done within reason. My point being, however, that it needs to be clean, it needs to be pristine, and as beautiful as possible. And therefore, people do what they can to dedicate things, to give beautiful chandeliers and so on. I want to tell you, the story goes, and it's a known story because the Rabbi used it once, and the Rabbi was very upset. And you can see it on the video, agitated by the fact that there was dirt on the floor, and no one bothered to pick it up. And the Rebbe said something to the effect, that it's known, and I believe it's Rashi. You know the Rashi commentary? Mm-hmm. Rashi is one of the greatest pillars of Jewish scholarship. The greatest one. Without Rashi, you cannot access the Torah, you cannot access the Tanakh, the Bible, you cannot access the Talmud. Mm-hmm. It's basically a sealed book for most of us. Without Rashi. And Rashi, you know why his parents merited to his birth? His father had a very long beard. And out of reverence for God, he would clean the dust in front of the ark with his beard. Didn't take a broom. He felt like he's not going to take another implement to do it. He's going to do it with his own body. And that's how he would clean it. And that's why he merited to have such a son who literally opened the eyes of all the Jewish people for all generations. Mm-hmm. So we see how important it is to make sure that a shul and a study hall is the nicest possible, or at least the cleanest possible. It doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be outrageous. That's not the point. You don't need to have, a Versace designer coming to make it. That's not necessary. But it has to be what we call in Yiddish balabatish. It has to be respectable. It has to be nice. It has to be a place that a person walks in and feels like, oh, this is a house of God. This is a respectable place.
We understand that concept very well.
It's good to keep the show clean. The best compliment I can get is when people come, they go, wow, the place is clean, it's nice, it smells good. Yeah, that's the way it should be. And it's not for me, it's for God. Yes. It doesn't matter how small or big the shul is, it needs to be a place that you feel good about, that you feel comfortable in, that you feel that there's a certain reverence. So that's as far as the synagogue is concerned. I will tell you that there are other issues and other factors that play a role in the construction of a synagogue, in the customs of a synagogue. To give you an example, here we don't have that so much because we never constructed this place from scratch. But however, there are certain things that you'll notice, and I want you to really pay attention to this. If you'll notice the bima, which is the table on which we read the Torah, in this case it's only a bima, it's only a table, a reading table. However, usually it's with an elaborate stage or dais, and with it's adorned and everything. So it's elevated so everybody can see. But you should know, according to Jewish law, it's meant to be in the middle of the synagogue. Okay? This idea, and they have it in some of the more modern synagogues, sadly, this was a deviation from Judaism, and I have to say, call it the way it is. Very sadly, this was Jews who were enlightened, or thought that they're enlightened, and they were trying to copy their non-Jewish neighbors. And they put the reading table in the front. And moreover, they put it facing the crowd. You know where that comes from. That comes from Christianity. That is not Jewish. Okay? And there was actually a time when many of the prominent rabbis, I'm talking about some of the greatest halachic authorities, forbade a religious Jew to walk in, so much as to walk into such a sanctuary, because of the fact that it deviates so much from Jewish tradition. There are places even where you'll notice this, that if they have the bima and it's close up to the front, they'll put at least one row of chairs in for whatever reason it's not practical for it to be in the middle of the synagogue, but this way it's not actually in the front. Okay, just to be certain that it's not in the front, at least one row of chairs or one bench, one row of seats in front of the thing. So it needs to have at least that. I'm just showing you an example where you think, what's the difference? Not here, nor there. No, it's very important. That's if it's permanent. Of course, if for some temporary reason I put a table near the wall and I read the Torah on it, that's not the end of the world. We're talking about when you're constructing the synagogue, when you're setting it up for services, as an official setup. Then there are other things too, the ark. Okay? Now, the ark may seem like, trivial thing, a place where you keep the Torah. Oh, no. It's a very, very holy place. In fact, once you're done using it for whatever reason, let's just say you're building a nicer ark. The old one can't just be discarded and thrown out. Why? Because not only was it part of a synagogue, it served the Torah. For that matter, even the bima cannot just be discarded. Typically what would happen is, if it's not being used in one place, they'll try to pass it on to another place that needs a nice one, but they're upgrading to something even better. Why? Because this is not something you just throw out. So I'm just saying, I'm just giving you an idea of how many issues can pop up in knowing what what a synagogue is and how it should be. Remember also another thing: the ark should be facing east, or what we call facing towards Jerusalem, because that's the direction you're supposed to pray. Right? Now, imagine you have the ark on one side and the direction to pray on the other side. That becomes a very serious issue. Is everybody going to have to turn their backs to the ark, which is disrespectful? You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Now, there's also the setup of the synagogue. There is a distinct difference between the way the Sephardic Jews have their synagogue set up and the Ashkenazi Jews. Ashkenazi Jews, typically, it's everybody facing forward, and the Chazan, the cantor, in the front, leading the service. Typically, on the right side, which is the southeast side of the ark, okay? That's where typically the cantor would be leading the services. In the Sephardic shul, it typically would be where the chazan, the cantor leading the services, it stands in the middle, and everybody faces there, and they only turn towards the east only during the Amidah service, which requires that we face Jerusalem. These are, depending on the custom, either way is fine. But, depending if you're Sephardic, if you're Ashkenazi. But the bottom line is, like it says in the Mishnah, it says that one should always, when they pray, should pray in the direction of Jerusalem, and more specifically where the Holy Temple stood. However, if one doesn't know the direction, or one can't, for whatever reason, then at least you should direct your heart towards God. So that is, of course, obviously the most important in all of this. In Israel, you'll find this more typical because they kind of, like a lot of places, they construct a synagogue from scratch, and they have the ability to decide, where they want it facing and everything else. There's also other customs. Sometimes some places have a custom where they'll construct a synagogue, and at least the main sanctuary should end up having at least 12 windows. Why 12 windows?
12 tribes.
Corresponds to the 12 tribes, which is really the 12 pillars of Am Yisrael. So on and so forth. You see how every detail really plays a very, very big role, and very, very important. So I'm just saying, next time we come to synagogue, you're like, whoa, it's an important place, it's a special place, okay? Good example, when you build a synagogue, it says, today it's not so much not so possible, especially in places where they have skyscrapers, but typically, especially in the olden days where you had, the highest structure was a story or 2 or 3, it says that synagogue should be the tallest structure in the town, the tallest structure in the city. Because there's a verse that says, L'romem et bet Elokeinu, to elevate the house of our God. So you see, and by the way, you see the other side of it is, perhaps that's where people who tried to mimic Judaism in some way, that's where they came up with the idea of the steeple and so on and so forth, because to make it higher. Okay? In fact, there was times in Europe when Jews were forbidden to do so because it was so important. So there were restrictions on how high a synagogue can be, intentionally to squash that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just giving you some ideas of the importance of a synagogue. Just to conclude, we spoke about the synagogue, we spoke about the house of study, the Bet Knesset and the Bet Midrash, but it's important also to talk about the most practical miniature temple, miniature sanctuary. Remember I said that synagogue. And that is your home, my home. Every Jewish home is really a miniature sanctuary. And the Rebbe was a big champion of this, especially, that we need to bring God into our homes, a place where He's comfortable. So He should be comfortable in the Bet HaMikdash, in the Holy Temple. He should be comfortable in our homes. How do we do it? Think about it. You have the main components of the Bet HaMikdash is the Ark of glory. What was there? The Torah. A person should have a place with books of Torah in the house. For me, it's the most important thing that it's most prominently displayed. That's my decoration. You know, whether I study it or not is a separate issue, but it should be there. You walk in, you see books of Torah literature and of Torah interest. Then you have also, of course, you have the altar. What is the altar? It's the table. The table in the home is the altar. It says that a person's table is like the altar where you eat, and obviously you eat foods that are appropriate, that are kosher. You eat foods that are healthy. You eat foods that are going to give you the energy to do good and to serve God. That becomes your altar. Which, by the way, it's a total sidebar. Why we have salt on the table, and we did the bread with the salt, because every sacrifice had to have salt offered with it. You see, there's a connection. Then you have, of course, the kitchen, the place where you prepare the food, the place where you live, that the place is in spirit of godliness. Of course, you have a charity box in the house, you have a mezuzah on the door. This becomes, you do good there, you spend your life in a good, healthy, moral, ethical manner, serving God, serving the purpose of why we are alive. That becomes an actual sanctuary.
Indeed.
And this is the beauty of what Judaism teaches us and what really you want to take away with it from this Parsha. One doesn't need to go to a place or be a member in that synagogue in order to be holy. One needs to bring holiness into them. Of course, there are times that call for we should go to synagogue and we should pray together and so on. That's amazing and it's beautiful. It's something that we should do and is encouraged. But it's not exclusively that, because that becomes then a cap-out where you say, okay, if I'm not in synagogue, I'm not serving God. When you are in synagogue, you're serving God now on that level. When you're home, you can be serving Him even on a greater level. You're bringing God into your own home. What's greater than that?